on Australia Day, it seems to me that the worst thing you could do for Aboriginal people would be to change the date. That might sound a funny thing to say, but I say it for this reason. I think we ought to work hard to make Australia Day a day when we reflect more on the good and the bad. If you move the date, you'll forget the need for an honest debate about what happened, because there were aspects of it that were noble, the attempt to rehabilitate people. And in fact, the sailing orders were very clear that the local people were to be treated with great respect. That was all in the orders. But then there were the utterly dreadful things that happened. The disease, the massacres that followed later, which were truly appalling. I mean, unbelievable. And it wasn't until after the Mile Creek massacre that anybody was really brought to justice for what they'd done. My point, though, is that the best thing we can do on Australia Day, in my view, is to celebrate the good things and reflect on the things that we need to learn from. That'd be my sort of comment. And then we come to the issue that you've just raised, which is, what do we actually do to make a difference? We've got to, I know I've said it before, a bit hackneyed now, but break the cycle. Of all the terrible things that I saw, and I did see a lot of terrible things in my 19 years in public life, was in your hometown, Alice Springs, the one that's most deeply seared in my memory. I was out there on business of some sort, and I walked home one evening after I'd been to a dinner with a couple of members of my staff, and outside the casino were lots of Aboriginal kids, and you know how athletic a lot of them are, and they were kicking a football around and moving with enormous agility and what have you, but there was a bunch of them sitting on a bench. And it struck me that they looked really pretty miserable. So I went over and had a yarn with them, and they opened up after a while. And I actually said to one of them, "Mate, are you really looking worried? What's wrong?" He hadn't said much. And he said, "Our mums are in there. They're blowing a welfare check." He said, "A couple of days, my mates and I, we're going to be starving. And then we'll break into the school tuck shop to get something to eat. And then people will say how terrible we are, and we'll end up having getting into all sorts of trouble. What are we supposed to do?" And for me, that was a terrible moment. It just seems to me, and I suppose I'm asking your opinion on this, what we got to do in this whole debate is switch our attention to the children, to the next generation. How do we break the cycle? How do we get a group of them through, like your children, but in much bigger numbers, who have grown up emotionally secure and well-nourished and well-educated? Isn't it time to say, let's stop talking about the rights of adults and painting them as victims without in any way diminishing the challenges they faced, and turn our attention to the next generation, the kids, the ones who can't speak for themselves but are actually most vulnerable and most damaged?
Yes. Well, again, it's, I think, if we look at what's going on in our country, there has been a stigma around, removing Australian children who happen to be Aboriginal because of, what's happened in our country's history with the stolen generation. And I think that issue has been conflated. I think it's not recognised that within the stolen generation were many other stories than the most popular narrative that we know of, that children were removed because of their skin colour and, pushed into assimilation. There were, of course, many different stories with regard to the stolen generation.
Many different stories.
And that's a part of, again, acknowledging our history in its entirety and not particular narratives. That's recognising our history as human beings and not holding, all white Australians responsible who weren't even around during that time for what happened in our history. We need to get away. And what I see a lot now is the way the media use trigger words. They use the term, I think because David Gillespie recently said that He believes Aboriginal children should be adopted, and I agree with him entirely. But then you get news articles that will say, well, politicians want a second stolen generation. That's no way helpful for those children in those really dire circumstances who are begging to have the same opportunities as the kids whose parents run these media organisations, who can flippantly use terms like that in order to trigger an audience. They have utter disregard for these kids in those circumstances. And then those who are being driven by their ideologies are going to jump on that and use that as their focus instead of focusing again on the children.
Kids.
And these are adults behaving very selfishly, in my view. When one can't look within themselves to make change because of their own insecurities about who they are, that becomes damaging because there's children relying on these adults to be adults and put their welfare first. And I am a big believer that, there's a segregation going on with kids in care, and Aboriginal children are treated differently to other kids. And this is a result of the Bringing Them Home report. This is a result of the stigma attached to the stolen generation. And there's a reluctance to remove Aboriginal kids. They should be treated just like any other Australian child.
And it seems to me to be a gross injustice.
It is.
Against Aboriginal children.
It is.
Gross injustice.
It's the racism of low expectations. It's like, no, hands off. We're going to let these kids be in these, horrible circumstances and we're not going to lift the bar to where, it should be alongside other Australian children.